My name is David Swanson, by the way. I have very mixed emotions about being here to talk about the most unpleasant topic there is. But to do so with people willing to face it, to be here with Bruce and Kathy, and to be speaking to people who are already doing more than I am, already doing what needs to be done. How many of you saw a hearing in the Senate on Tuesday on drones? Some of you. This was a typical hearing up to a point, right? The Obama administration sent nobody. Most of the witnesses were your usual professors and so forth who didn't know any more than you do. But there was a young man named Fareah al-Muslimi who came from Yemen, whose village had been hit by a drone strike last week. This was as if that young girl's body that Kathy talked about had been brought in and put on the table in the U.S. Senate committee hearing room. This was Heinrich Himmler going out to see a little bit of one of the mass executions he'd ordered and being unable to stand it and crawling back to his office and creating gas chambers so that the guards wouldn't have to see the victims. And this is what they did after Mussolini spoke. They turned to the other witnesses. Now, what would you like to say? They didn't want to hear that, but it was remarkable for that to be there in that room. But what struck me the most in this hearing was the testimony of one of your usual law professors, a woman named Rosa Brooks, who put very succinctly, I thought, what the common wisdom is. And she said, if these drone strikes are part of a war, they're legal and they're good. If they're not part of a war, they're murder. One word, the word I've been trying to get everybody to use, damn it, for years, murder. And she said, we don't know if they're part of a war and perfectly fine, or not part of a war and therefore murder, because we haven't seen the secret memos. Right. Now, so what's the substantive difference between being part of a war and not being part of a war? It's nothing we can observe here in the heartland of the empire. It's nothing that Mr. al-Muslimi can observe in his village at the other end, the receiving end. It's something that can be put into a secret memo and stuffed in an envelope and put in a drawer that distinguishes perfectly fine from murder. Now, we know the facts. The facts are hardly in dispute. A single individual, President Barack Obama, is going through a list of people, men, women, and children, on Tuesdays, picking which ones to have murdered, having them murdered. And most of the people he's having murdered, most of the houses and buildings he's targeting, he doesn't know who's in there, doesn't know their names at all. Many of them have been identified as run-of-the-mill resistors to a foreign occupation of their or a neighboring nation. A handful. You know, most of the people are just innocent, have just been too close to the target. Most of the targets have not been identified. Many have been identified as resistors. And a handful have been identified as imminent, meaning eventual or theoretical threats to the United States of America. And he's having these people murdered. Now, in civilized war, in humane war, murder is allowed, but not torture, not rape, not theft, not shoplifting, not cheating on your taxes, just murder. Murder is the one crime that gets allowed. This is civilized war. In uncivilized war, which is what many of our fellow citizens think of, it's very hard to understand how the worst thing possible, murder on a large scale, is allowed. Why in the world can't you have a little torture too? It doesn't make sense to them, right? And so you have these two views of war competing, civilized and uncivilized. They're both wrong. They're both wrong. What is exposed in recognizing that the drone strikes are murder is that war itself is criminal mass murder. This is what we have to arrive at. And this distinction of whether it's murder or it's perfectly fine is absolutely regardless of where or when. It's the entire globe, every day of the year from here on out. And when young men of so-called fighting age in predominantly Muslim countries are killed, they are posthumously identified as enemies. What would this make you think if you were a young Muslim man and you were taught that killing is righteous and killing is everywhere and the war is everywhere? How do people accused of creating bombs in Boston think altogether differently from people who blow up peaceful villages in Yemen? Right? This is the mindset we are spreading. I just got off a plane from Dallas. We were dedicating the Bush Library, and I greeted some people in their fancy Sunday best coming out of the dedication ceremony with the 5 felons, with the 5 former and current presidents, and a woman came up and started screaming at me, "Why aren't you protesting Obama? Why don't you people protest Obama? Where have you been for 5 years?" And I said, "Ma'am, can you read?" I was wearing a shirt that said, "Arrest Bush and Obama." And, "Ma'am, can you read?" And she said, "Yeah, but not all of the rest of those people, not all of those banners, you're not," and she was absolutely right. She was absolutely right. I hadn't seen most of my friends for 5 years that were at this reunion in Dallas. And so then she turns to a different angle and says, "Well, but if Obama does it, then why don't you like it? Why don't you approve of it?" Because this is how people think. You're with Bush or you're with Obama. We have to be against murder. We have a president who wanted us to know, and wanted us to know before the election that he goes through that list of men, women, and children on Tuesdays and has them murdered. He wanted us to know that because of the Bush-Cheney years and how we did not hold them accountable for their crimes. So we have to be against murder, we have to be for economic conversion, we have to be for counter-recruitment, and we have to be against each new war. And we have to be against each new war not just because of the cost to U.S. men and women, who, by the way, were 0.3%, not 100% of the deaths in the war on Iraq. We have to be against wars not just because of the financial cost. We have to be against wars because they are mass murder of human beings. And we have to say no to a war on Syria right now. We have to say it as loudly as we've ever said no to any war. We have to say it because war is worse than anything it can be used to prevent or correct or fix. We have to say no. The idea that people might be killed with chemical weapons in Syria is not a justification for killing many times that number of people with cluster bombs and white phosphorus and napalm and hellfire missiles. These people do not need to be killed in greater numbers with the correct type of weaponry. They need to not be killed. We have to say this. Our wars are one-sided slaughters. We cannot be afraid to say this to people. Americans do not support the mass murder of civilians. They do not support one-sided slaughters. They don't know they are happening. The majority of Americans believe the war on Iraq benefited Iraq and cost us. When they agreed with us and wanted it ended year after year, they wanted an act of philanthropy ended. We have to explain to people that we destroyed that country, that we did not do it as a benefit, that there is not a nation to be pointed to that we've ever built, that there is not a humanitarian war that's ever served humanity, that Syria is not going to be the first, that if our government gave a damn, it would be looking at Bahrain. That we have a government that uses our emotions, our goodwill, our humanitarian sympathies for evil purposes and does not mean well. We have to be up to this opposition. I appreciated Kathy mentioning Jeremy Scahill, and I want to mention that there is a movie coming out this summer that is going to be in the big so-called mainstream movie theaters called Dirty Wars. And there is going to be a possibility to organize events like this one afterwards, but potentially to fill a bigger space in this gym with people who've never been here. And I encourage you to do that. And I would mention also that in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I live, we passed a resolution keeping drones out of Charlottesville, and we encourage the state of Virginia to keep drones out. And we now have a moratorium on drones in the state of Virginia, which the governor is going to sign with certain loopholes. And we need to do that everywhere. And finally, a website where I work called rootsaction.org. It has a huge coalition of every organization I know of, and if yours isn't on there, please join us. with a petition to ban weaponized drones from the world. And we're making this an international effort, and I encourage you